The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Mitchell adjusted the straps of her heavy pack. At 22, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her slight frame dwarfed by the towering soldiers around her. The other members of her unit barely acknowledged her presence as they prepared for what would become one of the most dangerous missions in recent memory. Sarah had earned the nickname Cargo Girl during her first week of deployment. While her fellow soldiers carried weapons and tactical gear, she was assigned to logistics and supply management. Her job involved ensuring ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment reached the right places at the right times. It wasn't glamorous work, and it certainly didn't earn her any respect from the hardened veterans who made up the majority of their forward operating base. The base itself sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills and sparse vegetation. Intelligence reports indicated heavy enemy activity in the surrounding areas, but their mission remained critical. A remote outpost had been cut off from supply lines for over a week, and the soldiers stationed there were running dangerously low on everything from food to ammunition. Sarah's convoy would be responsible for delivering these essential supplies through hostile territory. Sergeant Rodriguez, the convoy leader, gathered the team around a dusty map spread across the hood of their lead vehicle. His weathered face showed the strain of countless similar missions, and his eyes held the wariness of someone who had seen too much combat. He pointed to a winding route through the mountains that would take them to their destination. The road winds through 3 major choke points, Rodriguez explained, his voice carrying the authority of experience. Intelligence suggests possible enemy positions at each location. We move fast, stay alert, and stick together. No heroics, no deviations from the plan. Sarah listened intently while checking her equipment one final time. Unlike the others, she didn't carry a primary weapon. Instead, her gear consisted of communication devices, medical supplies, and the detailed manifest of everything they were transporting. Her role was considered support, not combat, despite the obvious dangers they would face. Private Collins, a muscular man in his mid-20s, glanced at Sarah with obvious skepticism. He had made his feelings clear from the beginning about having someone like her on combat missions. In his view, she was a liability, someone who would need protection rather than provide it. His friends shared similar opinions, often making comments just loud enough for her to hear about how support personnel should stay safely behind base walls. The convoy consisted of 3 heavily armored vehicles loaded with supplies destined for the isolated outpost. Sarah rode in the middle vehicle, surrounded by crates of ammunition, medical equipment, and food rations. The vehicle's armor provided some protection, but everyone knew that in these mountains, armor could only do so much against a well-planned ambush. As they rolled through the base gates, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of nervousness and determination that accompanied every mission outside the wire. She had joined the military to serve her country, not to win popularity contests with her fellow soldiers. Her commitment to the mission and to the soldiers depending on those supplies drove her forward despite the constant dismissive treatment she received. The first hour of their journey passed without incident. The convoy moved through relatively flat terrain before beginning the climb into the mountains where the real danger lay. Sarah monitored their progress on her GPS device while maintaining radio contact with their destination. The outpost commander's voice crackled through the static, expressing gratitude for the incoming supplies and providing updates on their deteriorating situation. The isolated outpost had been under sporadic attack for days. Enemy forces had established positions in the surrounding hills, making resupply by air too dangerous to attempt. The ground convoy represented their only hope for receiving the critical supplies needed to maintain their defensive position. Failure wasn't an option, as abandoning the outpost would give enemy forces a strategic foothold in the region. Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom as they approached the first choke point. The road ahead narrowed between 2 steep hillsides, creating an ideal location for an ambush. All 3 vehicles slowed their pace, with gunners scanning the rocky slopes above for any sign of enemy activity. Sarah checked her communication equipment, ensuring they could call for backup if needed. The tension in their vehicle was palpable as they navigated through the narrow passage. Every shadow on the hillsides seemed potentially threatening, and every loose rock that tumbled down the slope caused hands to tighten on weapons. Sarah found herself holding her breath as they moved through the most dangerous section, surrounded by perfect sniper positions and natural cover for enemy forces. They emerged from the first choke point without incident, but Rodriguez reminded everyone to stay alert. The next two sections would be even more dangerous, as intelligence reports suggested increased enemy activity in those areas. Sarah double-checked the manifest, ensuring every critical item was properly secured and accounted for. The soldiers at the outpost were counting on these supplies for their survival. The second choke point approached faster than expected. This section features a series of switchback turns that force the convoy to move slowly while completely exposed on the mountainside. Sarah watched through the small window as the landscape changed around them. The rocky terrain provided countless hiding places for enemy forces, and the steep drop-offs on one side of the road eliminated any possibility of evasive maneuvering. Collins shifted nervously in his seat, checking his weapon for the 10th time in as many minutes. Despite his earlier bravado about Sarah's presence, the reality of their vulnerable position was affecting everyone in the vehicle. The driver maintained steady communication with the other vehicles, coordinating their movement through the dangerous terrain. Halfway through the switchback section, Rodriguez's voice exploded through the radio with an urgent warning. Enemy movement had been spotted on the ridgeline ahead, and the convoy needed to increase speed immediately. Sarah felt her stomach drop as their vehicle accelerated through the treacherous turns, the heavy load of supplies shifting with each sharp curve. The sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere ahead as the lead vehicle came under attack. Rodriguez's voice commanded immediate defensive positions as the convoy ground to a halt. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of sniper rifles echoing off the canyon walls, followed by the heavier response of their own machine guns. Through the chaos of radio chatter, Sarah learned that the lead vehicle had taken multiple hits but remained operational. However, enemy snipers' position on the ridgeline had them pinned down in an extremely vulnerable position. Any attempt to move forward would expose them to continued fire, while staying in place made them sitting targets. Collins and the other soldiers in Sarah's vehicle prepared to dismount and provide covering fire for the trapped lead vehicle. As they opened the doors, Sarah realized that her role in this mission was about to change dramatically. The carefully planned logistics operation had become a firefight for survival, and every member of the convoy would need to contribute to their collective defense. The enemy snipers had chosen their positions well. From their elevated positions on the ridgeline, they could see the entire convoy route and had clear fields of fire in multiple directions. Sarah could hear bullets striking the armor of their vehicle as the enemy forces attempted to disable their transportation and trap them in the killing zone. Rodriguez's tactical experience became evident as he coordinated their response to the ambush. He directed covering fire toward the suspected sniper positions while organizing a flanking movement to neutralize the threat. However, the rocky terrain and limited visibility made it extremely difficult to locate the exact positions of the enemy shooters. Sarah remained in the vehicle, monitoring communications and coordinating with the base for potential backup support. However, she realized that air support would be limited due to the confined terrain and the risk of hitting friendly forces. The convoy would need to fight their way out of the ambush using their own resources and tactical skills. The firefight intensified as more enemy positions revealed themselves. What had initially appeared to be a small group of snipers was actually a well-coordinated ambush involving multiple enemy fighters positioned throughout the surrounding hills. Sarah counted at least 6 different firing positions based on the incoming rounds and muzzle flashes she could observe. Collins returned to the vehicle after attempting to advance up the hillside, his face flushed with exertion and frustration. The enemy positions were too well concealed and protected for a direct assault with their current numbers and equipment. They needed a different approach to break out of the ambush and continue their mission to the isolated outpost. As the minutes passed, Sarah realized that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The enemy forces seemed to have unlimited ammunition and perfect knowledge of the terrain. Their own ammunition supplies were finite, and staying pinned down in the open would eventually lead to their defeat or capture. The The radio crackled with increasingly urgent messages from the outpost they were trying to reach. The soldiers there could hear the firefight echoing through the mountains and knew that their lifeline was under attack. Without the supplies carried by Sarah's convoy, the outpost would be forced to abandon their position within 24 hours. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to call for immediate evacuation of the most seriously wounded members of their team. 2 soldiers in the lead vehicle had been hit during the initial ambush, and their condition was deteriorating rapidly. However, any evacuation attempt would require securing a landing zone and suppressing the enemy fire long enough for a helicopter to safely approach. Sarah volunteered to help establish the evacuation landing zone, despite the obvious dangers involved. Her offer was initially dismissed by Collins and the others, who maintained their belief that she lacked the combat training necessary for such a dangerous mission. However, Rodriguez recognized that they needed every available person to coordinate the complex operation. The enemy snipers seemed to anticipate their every move, adjusting their fire to prevent any significant advance by the convoy's forces. Sarah began to study the pattern of enemy fire, noting the timing and locations of shots. Her logistics training had taught her to analyze complex systems and identify patterns, skills that proved unexpectedly valuable in combat situations. Through her careful observation, Sarah noticed that the enemy snipers were rotating their positions in a predictable sequence. They would fire from one location, then move to a secondary position while their partner provided covering fire. This rotation allowed them to maintain continuous pressure while avoiding counter-sniper fire from the convoy's designated marksmen. She shared her observations with Rodriguez, who immediately recognized the tactical value of her analysis. If they could predict the sniper's movement pattern, they might be able to time an advance that would catch the enemy fighters between positions. However, the timing would need to be perfect, and any mistake could result in additional casualties. The plan required precise coordination between multiple elements of their defense. Sarah would monitor the sniper fire pattern and provide timing information, while Rodriguez coordinated the advance of their assault team. Collins and the other soldiers would provide covering fire and attempt to suppress the enemy positions during the crucial moment when the snipers were moving between locations. As they prepared to implement the plan, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her analysis and timing would determine whether their breakout attempt succeeded or failed catastrophically. The lives of her fellow soldiers and the fate of the isolated outpost now depended on her ability to read the enemy's tactical pattern correctly. The radio brought news that the wounded soldier's condition was continuing to deteriorate. They needed immediate medical evacuation, but the enemy fire made any helicopter approach impossible. The convoy was running out of time and options, making their next move potentially their last chance to save everyone and complete their critical mission. Rodriguez gave Sarah the responsibility for calling the timing of their assault. Her heart pounded as she watched the hillside, waiting for the telltale signs that the enemy snipers were beginning their rotation sequence. Everything they had trained for and everything the isolated outpost needed for survival came down to this single moment of tactical execution. The seconds stretched like hours as Sarah monitored the enemy fire pattern. She could see muzzle flashes from the primary sniper position and knew that within moments, the shooter would begin moving to his alternate location. The success of their entire mission now rested on her ability to recognize that exact moment and coordinate their response with split-second precision. Through the chaos and danger of their situation, Sarah realized that her role as cargo girl was about to be permanently redefined. The supplies she had been tasked with delivering remained critical, but her contribution to their survival would extend far beyond logistics and inventory management. The convoy's fate now depended on skills she never knew she possessed and courage she had never been required to demonstrate. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she raised the binoculars to study the enemy positions more carefully. Through the magnified lenses, she could see details that had been invisible to the naked eye. The enemy snipers were wearing camouflage clothing that blended perfectly with the rocky terrain, but their movement between positions created brief moments of visibility that could be exploited. Rodriguez crawled over to her position, keeping low to avoid the sporadic gunfire that continued to pepper their location. His expression showed a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope as he listened to Sarah's detailed analysis of the enemy's tactical pattern. Time was running out, and conventional approaches to breaking the ambush had already failed. "You're certain about the timing?" Rodriguez asked, his voice barely audible above the sound of gunfire. "If you're wrong, we'll lose the element of surprise and probably several more people." Sarah nodded firmly, though her heart was racing with the enormous responsibility. They're moving in a clockwise rotation every 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The primary sniper displaces first, followed by a spotter 15 seconds later. That gives us a 20-second window where their overwatch position is unmanned. Collins, who had been listening from nearby, shook his head in disbelief. "You want us to bet our lives on her counting seconds? She's never been in combat before this mission. How could she possibly know their pattern better than we do?" The question stung, but Sarah maintained her focus on the enemy positions. She had been studying their movements for over 30 minutes, timing each rotation with the stopwatch function on her GPS device. The pattern was consistent and predictable, likely the result of standard tactical training rather than field improvisation. Rodriguez weighed the options carefully. Their current position was untenable, with enemy fire becoming more accurate as the shooters adjusted their aim points. The wounded soldiers needed immediate evacuation, and the supplies they carried were desperately needed at the isolated outpost. Doing nothing guaranteed failure of their mission and possible loss of life. "Explain the plan one more time," Rodriguez commanded, his attention focused entirely on Sarah's analysis. Sarah pointed toward the ridgeline, where she had identified the primary sniper position. "The main threat is positioned behind that large boulder formation, approximately 400 meters up the slope. He has clear line of sight to our entire convoy route. His backup position is 30 meters to the east, behind a cluster of smaller rocks." She continued her tactical briefing with growing confidence. "When he moves from primary to secondary position, he follows a specific route that takes him behind the ridgeline for approximately 20 seconds. During that window, we can advance up the slope without being observed from the high ground." Rodriguez studied the terrain through his own binoculars, evaluating Sarah's assessment against his years of combat experience. The route she had identified did indeed provide concealment from the main sniper position, though it would still leave them exposed to fire from other enemy locations scattered throughout the hills. "What about the other shooters?" Collins interjected. "Even if we neutralize the main position, there are at least 5 other enemy fighters out there." Sarah had considered this problem as well. "The other positions are supporting the main sniper team. If we can eliminate or suppress the primary threat, the others will likely withdraw to avoid being outflanked. They're positioned for ambush, not sustained combat against an organized assault." The logic of her analysis was sound, but Rodriguez knew that combat rarely followed logical predictions. However, their alternatives were limited, and Sarah's plan offered their best chance of breaking out of the killing zone. He made the decision to trust her tactical assessment and began coordinating the assault. "Johnson, take 3 men and move to the right flank," Rodriguez ordered. "Provide covering fire toward the secondary positions when Sarah gives the signal. Collins, you're with me on the direct assault up the slope. Sarah, you stay here and coordinate timing for both elements." Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with terror as she accepted responsibility for coordinating the tactical operation. This was far beyond anything she had imagined when she joined the military as a logistics specialist. Her training had focused on supply chain management and inventory control, not battlefield tactics and fire coordination. The wounded soldiers in the lead vehicle were showing signs of shock and blood loss. Their medic had done everything possible with available supplies, but they needed surgical intervention that could only be provided at a proper medical facility. The evacuation helicopter remained on standby, waiting for the convoy to secure a safe landing zone. Sarah checked her watch and began counting down to the next rotation period. "Sniper displacement in 2 minutes, 30 seconds, she announced through the radio. "All elements prepare for coordinated advance on my signal." The next 2 minutes passed with agonizing slowness as everyone prepared for what could be their last chance to escape the ambush. Sarah watched the enemy position through her binoculars, noting every detail that might affect the timing of their assault. The sniper was still in his primary position, occasionally firing toward their convoy to maintain pressure. Displacement beginning now, Sarah whispered into her radio as she observed the first signs of movement from the enemy position. Stand by for execute command. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see the enemy sniper gathering his equipment and preparing to move to his alternate firing position. His movements were deliberate and professional, indicating military training rather than a regular militia background. This made him more predictable, but also more dangerous once he re-established his position. Execute, 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 Sarah commanded as the sniper disappeared behind the ridgeline. Rodriguez and Collins burst from their concealed positions and began their assault up the rocky slope. Johnson's team simultaneously opened fire on the suspected enemy positions, creating multiple distractions for the remaining enemy fighters. Sarah watched through her binoculars, tracking their progress and monitoring for any signs that the enemy sniper was returning to his position earlier than expected. The assault team made good progress up the slope, using the terrain features Sarah had identified to avoid observation from the high ground. However, enemy fire from the supporting positions was more intense than anticipated, forcing them to take cover behind a cluster of boulders only halfway to their objective. Suppressive fire on the eastern slope, Sarah called to Johnson's team. Assault element needs covering fire to continue advance. Johnson's machine gunner opened up with long bursts toward the suspected enemy positions, forcing the shooters to keep their heads down and disrupting their aim. The heavy weapon's distinctive sound echoed through the canyon, temporarily drowning out the crack of enemy sniper rifles. Sarah continued monitoring the primary sniper position, counting seconds until the enemy shooter would return to his original location. They had used half of their available time window, and Rodriguez's team still needed to close the remaining distance to neutralize the threat. Time warning, Sarah announced. 10 seconds until sniper returns to primary position. Rodriguez acknowledged the warning and pushed his team forward in a final rush toward the enemy position. They reached the base of the boulder formation just as Sarah spotted movement, indicating the sniper's return. The timing had been perfect, allowing them to approach undetected and catch the enemy fighter by surprise. The sound of close-quarters combat erupted from the ridgeline as Rodriguez's team engaged the enemy sniper at point-blank range. Within seconds, the distinctive crack of the sniper rifle fell silent, indicating that the primary threat had been eliminated. However, enemy fire from the supporting positions continued with undiminished intensity. Primary target neutralized, Rodriguez reported through the radio. Continuing assault on secondary positions. Sarah felt a surge of relief and pride as she realized her tactical analysis had been correct. The enemy sniper's movement pattern had been exactly as she predicted, and her timing had allowed Rodriguez's team to approach undetected. However, the mission was far from complete, and the remaining enemy fighters still posed a significant threat. The elimination of the primary sniper position had an immediate effect on the enemy's tactical coordination. Without the overwatch provided by the main shooter, the supporting positions became less effective and more vulnerable to counterattack. Sarah could observe this change in their fire patterns, which became more sporadic and less accurately directed. Collins radioed from his position near the eliminated sniper nest, his voice carrying a note of surprise and grudging respect. Sarah's analysis was dead-on accurate. The enemy had perfect fields of fire from this position, and they were definitely following the movement pattern she identified. Sarah felt a moment of vindication, but quickly refocused on the ongoing tactical situation. The remaining enemy positions still needed to be cleared before they could establish a secure landing zone for the medical evacuation helicopter. Her role was shifting from pattern analysis to real-time tactical coordination. "Johnson, can you get a clear shot on the eastern position?" Sarah asked through the radio while studying the terrain through her binoculars. "Negative, too much dead space between here and there," Johnson replied. "We need someone to spot for indirect fire, or we need to assault each position individually." Sarah realized that her elevated position in the convoy provided her with a better view of the overall battlefield than any of the soldiers actively engaged in the firefight. Her logistics training had taught her to maintain situational awareness of multiple moving parts simultaneously, a skill that translated well to coordinating tactical operations. Rodriguez, I have visibility on 3 enemy positions from my location, Sarah reported. I can provide targeting information for each one. Rodriguez, who was beginning to appreciate Sarah's unexpected tactical contributions, immediately accepted her offer. Go ahead, walk Johnson's team onto the targets. Sarah began providing detailed targeting instructions, using landmarks and reference points to guide Johnson's machine gun team toward each enemy position. Her ability to maintain overall situational awareness while tracking multiple threats simultaneously proved invaluable in coordinating the complex operation. The first enemy position was eliminated within minutes after Sarah provided accurate targeting information. The remaining enemy fighters, realizing that their tactical advantage was disappearing, began attempting to withdraw from their positions. However, Rodriguez had anticipated this possibility and positioned his assault team to cut off their most likely escape routes. Enemy movement on the western slope, Sarah reported, tracking the fleeing fighters through her binoculars. 2 individuals moving north toward the ridgeline. Johnson's team adjusted their fire toward the escaping enemy fighters, successfully preventing their withdrawal and forcing them to surrender their positions. Within 20 minutes of Sarah's initial timing command, the entire enemy force had been eliminated or neutralized, and the convoy's route was secure. The immediate threat eliminated, Sarah coordinated the establishment of a landing zone for the medical evacuation helicopter. Her logistics expertise proved valuable in organizing the complex operation, which required clearing debris, marking the landing area, and coordinating with air support to ensure safe approach and departure. The evacuation helicopter arrived within 30 minutes, landing in the secure zone that Sarah had helped establish. The wounded soldiers were quickly loaded aboard and transported to the nearest medical facility, where their injuries could receive proper treatment. Their survival was directly attributable to the successful tactical operation that Sarah had initiated and coordinated. As the convoy prepared to continue their mission to the isolated outpost, Collins approached Sarah with an expression of genuine respect. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Your tactical analysis saved lives today and probably saved the entire mission. I was wrong about your capabilities. Sarah accepted his apology graciously, though she knew that proving herself in combat didn't necessarily mean acceptance by all of her peers. The nickname Cargo Girl would probably stick, but perhaps its meaning would evolve to reflect her demonstrated capabilities rather than perceived limitations. Rodriguez gathered the convoy for a final briefing before continuing to their destination. The elimination of the enemy ambush had cleared their route, but they remained in hostile territory where additional threats could materialize at any time. Sarah's role in the mission had fundamentally changed, with her tactical coordination becoming as important as her logistics responsibilities. The convoy resumed movement toward the isolated outpost, now traveling through terrain that Sarah had helped secure through her unexpected demonstration of tactical skills. The supplies they carried remained critically important, but the mission had become something far more significant than a simple logistics operation. As they approached the final checkpoint before reaching their destination, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her role had evolved during the course of a single mission. She had joined the military to serve her country and had expected to contribute through logistics and support operations. However, combat had revealed capabilities and instincts that she never knew she possessed. The isolated outpost appeared through the morning haze like a fortress carved from the mountain itself, built into a natural depression between 3 rocky peaks. The position provided commanding views of the surrounding valleys while offering protection from direct assault. However, as Sarah's convoy approached the perimeter, the signs of sustained combat were immediately apparent. Sandbag fortifications showed multiple impact craters from mortar rounds and rocket-propelled grenades. The communication tower had been damaged, with twisted metal and severed cables hanging like broken spiderwebs. Most concerning, several defensive positions appeared to be unmanned, suggesting that the outpost garrison had suffered significant casualties during the prolonged siege. Lieutenant Morrison, the outpost commander, met the convoy at the main gate with obvious relief written across his dirt-streaked face. He was a young officer, probably fresh from military academy, but his eyes held the haunted look of someone who had aged years in the span of days. The responsibility for maintaining this critical position had clearly taken its toll on him and his remaining soldiers. "Thank God you made it through," Morrison said as he shook hands with Rodriguez. "We've been down to our last magazines for 2 days. The enemy has been probing our perimeter constantly, and we've had to ration ammunition to the point where we could barely return fire." Sarah supervised the unloading of critical supplies while listening to Morrison's briefing about the tactical situation. The outpost had been under siege for over a week, with enemy forces maintaining positions in the surrounding hills. Artillery support had been unavailable due to the remote location, and air support had been limited by weather and the risk of hitting friendly forces in the confined terrain. The garrison originally consisted of 30 soldiers, but casualties and medical evacuations had reduced their effective strength to 18 men. They had been surviving on quarter rations and were completely out of medical supplies. Most critically, their ammunition reserves were down to less than 50 rounds per soldier, making any sustained defense impossible. Rodriguez studied the tactical situation with growing concern. The convoy's original mission was to deliver supplies and return to base immediately. However, the outpost's desperate condition and the obvious enemy presence in the surrounding area made immediate withdrawal potentially disastrous for the isolated garrison. "What's the enemy's strength assessment?" Rodriguez asked while Sarah continued coordinating the supply distribution. Morrison pointed toward the eastern ridgeline, where Sarah had neutralized the sniper position earlier. "We've identified at least 40 enemy fighters in prepared positions throughout these hills. They've been conducting coordinated attacks every night, testing our defenses and looking for weak points. Last night, they managed to breach our outer perimeter before we drove them back." Sarah paused in her inventory management as she realized the implications of Morrison's report. The enemy force that had ambushed their convoy was only a small element of a much larger group that had essentially surrounded the outpost. Their successful breakout from the ambush had been possible because they were facing a limited number of fighters, not because they had defeated the entire enemy force. Collins approached Sarah as she was checking the medical supply distribution. His attitude toward her had completely changed since witnessing her tactical performance during the ambush. "Rodriguez wants to see you at the command post," he said. "I think they're planning something that will require your input." Sarah found Rodriguez, and Morrison hunched over a map of the surrounding area, discussing various tactical options. The conversation stopped as she approached, and both officers turned their attention to her with expressions that suggested her role in future operations would be significant. "Sarah, we need your assessment of the enemy's tactical capabilities," Rodriguez said without preamble. "Based on what you observed during the ambush, how do you think they'll respond to our presence here?" The question caught Sarah off guard, as she had never been consulted for tactical intelligence assessments before. However, her careful observation during the convoy ambush had given her insights into the enemy's methods and capabilities that could prove valuable for planning the outpost defense. "The ambush team was well-trained and disciplined," Sarah began, organizing her thoughts carefully. "Their positioning was professional, and they followed standard tactical procedures for movement and fire control. However, they seemed to lack flexibility when their initial plan was disrupted." Morrison leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean by lack of flexibility?" Sarah pointed to the map, indicating the location where the ambush had occurred. "When we broke their primary overwatch position, the supporting elements didn't adapt their tactics effectively. They continued following their original plan, even when the situation had changed dramatically in our favor." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "That suggests conventional military training rather than guerrilla warfare experience. They're following doctrine instead of improvising based on changing conditions." The tactical discussion was interrupted by the sound of incoming mortar rounds exploding near the outpost's outer perimeter. Sarah instinctively ducked as the concussions echoed off the surrounding mountains. But the officers seemed to treat the bombardment as routine harassment rather than a serious threat. They do that every few hours, Morrison explained as the explosion subsided. Probably trying to conserve ammunition while keeping us on edge. The rounds are rarely accurate enough to cause significant damage, but they prevent us from getting any real rest. Sarah realized that the enemy's harassment tactics revealed another aspect of their operational capabilities. The consistent timing and limited intensity suggested ammunition constraints similar to what the outpost garrison was experiencing. A well-supplied enemy force would have maintained continuous bombardment rather than sporadic harassment. Lieutenant Morrison, how accurate has their indirect fire been? Sarah asked, surprising both officers with the technical nature of her question. Morrison consulted his logbook before responding. Over the past week, they've fired approximately 60 mortar rounds. Only 12 have landed inside our defensive perimeter, and most of those were on the outer edges. No direct hits on critical positions. Sarah's logistics training had included analysis of supply consumption rates and operational efficiency. The enemy's poor accuracy combined with their apparent ammunition conservation suggested that they were operating with limited resources and possibly inadequate training on their heavy weapon systems. Rodriguez, I think they're facing the same supply problems we are, Sarah concluded. The sporadic bombardment and poor accuracy indicate they're rationing ammunition and possibly using inexperienced crews on their mortars. This assessment had significant implications for planning the outpost's defense. If the enemy was also dealing with supply shortages, they might be vulnerable to a well-coordinated counterattack that forced them to expend their limited ammunition reserves rapidly. Rodriguez and Morrison exchanged glances before Rodriguez posed the question that Sarah had been expecting. Would you be willing to conduct reconnaissance of the enemy positions? Your analytical skills could provide intelligence that might allow us to break this siege. The request was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah had proven herself capable of tactical analysis under fire, but reconnaissance missions involved extended exposure to enemy observation and potential capture. However, she also realized that her unique perspective might be exactly what was needed to identify weaknesses in the enemy's siege tactics. What kind of reconnaissance are you considering? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline surge. Morrison spread a larger map across the table, showing the detailed terrain surrounding the outpost. We need to know their exact positions, ammunition storage locations, and command structure. Most importantly, we need to identify their supply routes so we could disrupt their logistics. Sarah studied the map carefully, noting the various ridgelines and valley approaches that could provide concealed movement routes. Her experience during the convoy ambush had taught her to read terrain differently, identifying not just geographic features, but tactical advantages and vulnerabilities. The reconnaissance would be conducted at night, Rodriguez added. Two-person team, minimal equipment, focus on observation rather than engagement. You will be paired with Jenkins, our best scout. Jenkins was a quiet soldier who had earned a reputation for being able to move through enemy territory undetected. His reconnaissance reports had been instrumental in identifying enemy positions during the siege, but he lacked Sarah's analytical background for assessing the tactical significance of what he observed. Sarah accepted the mission despite her nervousness about operating in enemy territory. Her success during the convoy ambush had given her confidence in her ability to contribute meaningfully to combat operations, and the isolated outpost survival might depend on the intelligence they could gather. The reconnaissance mission would launch after nightfall, giving Sarah several hours to prepare equipment and study the planned route. She spent time with Jenkins learning about movement techniques for avoiding detection and communication procedures for reporting observations without compromising their position. Morrison provided a detailed briefing on known enemy positions based on previous reconnaissance and observed muzzle flashes during firefights. However, he emphasized that the enemy had likely relocated many of their positions since the convoy's arrival, making fresh intelligence critical for planning any counterattack. As evening approached, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that had carried her through the convoy ambush. Her role in the military had evolved far beyond anything she had imagined when she enlisted as a logistics specialist. However, each challenge had revealed new capabilities and strengths that she never knew she possessed. The outpost defenders gathered for a final equipment check and tactical briefing. Sarah's transformation from cargo girl to tactical asset had been noticed by everyone in the garrison, and several soldiers approached her with expressions of respect and encouragement. The nickname persisted, but its meaning had evolved to reflect her demonstrated capabilities rather than perceived limitations. Collins surprised Sarah by offering his personal sidearm for the reconnaissance mission. "You've earned the right to carry this," he said simply. "Bring it back in one piece, along with yourself." Sarah accepted the weapon, understanding that the gesture represented complete acceptance by her peers. The same soldiers who had questioned her presence on combat missions now trusted her with their most dangerous assignments. The recognition was gratifying, but it also carried the weight of enormous responsibility. Rodriguez provided final instructions as darkness fell across the mountain landscape. "Your primary objective is intelligence gathering. Avoid contact with enemy forces unless absolutely necessary for survival. We need you to return with actionable intelligence, not to engage in heroics." Sarah and Jenkins moved through the outpost's defensive perimeter under cover of darkness, beginning their infiltration into enemy-controlled territory. The night was clear with excellent visibility, providing good conditions for observation, but also increasing the risk of detection during movement. The first phase of their mission involved approaching the ridgeline, where Sarah had identified the primary sniper position during the convoy ambush. Jenkins wanted to confirm whether the enemy had reoccupied the position and establish a baseline for their current defensive posture. Moving through the rocky terrain in complete darkness required careful attention to every footstep and handheld. Sarah discovered that her small stature, which had been a disadvantage in other military contexts, was actually beneficial for moving silently through confined spaces between boulders and brush. Jenkins communicated through hand signals and whispered commands, teaching Sarah the techniques for maintaining stealth while covering ground efficiently. His years of reconnaissance experience were evident in every movement, as he seemed to flow through the terrain without disturbing loose rocks or vegetation. They reached their first observation position after an hour of careful movement. Through night vision equipment, Sarah could see that the enemy had indeed reoccupied the sniper position, but with different personnel and equipment than the original team. This suggested a rotation schedule that could be exploited for future operations. "Two fighters, different weapons than before," Jenkins whispered while Sarah took notes on her observation pad. "Looks like they're settling in for a long watch, with sleeping bags and extended supplies." Sarah studied the position through her own night vision device, noting details that would be important for tactical planning. The enemy fighters had improved the position since the convoy ambush, adding camouflage netting and constructing better cover from indirect fire. More importantly, Sarah observed supply containers that hadn't been present during the convoy ambush. The enemy was clearly receiving regular resupply, which contradicted her earlier assessment about their logistics limitations. This new intelligence would require a complete reassessment of their capabilities and intentions. Jenkins guided them to their next observation position, located on a parallel ridgeline that provided oversight of multiple enemy locations. The movement required crossing an exposed valley where detection would be almost certain if enemy sentries were alert and properly positioned. However, as they crossed the danger area, Sarah noticed that the enemy's security procedures were inconsistent with their tactical proficiency in other areas. Sentries were not positioned to cover the most obvious infiltration routes, and their observation patterns had predictable gaps that could be exploited. "Their perimeter security doesn't match their tactical capabilities," Sarah whispered to Jenkins as they established their next observation position. "Either they're overconfident, or they're not as well trained as we initially assessed." From their elevated position, Sarah could observe the enemy's main encampment for the first time. The sight was both encouraging and disturbing, as it revealed strengths and weaknesses that would significantly impact any planned counterattack by the outpost defenders. The enemy encampment spread across the valley floor like a small military base, with organized rows of tents, supply stockpiles, and defensive positions. Through her night vision equipment, Sarah counted approximately 60 fighters, significantly more than Morrison's original estimate. However, She also observed details that revealed critical vulnerabilities in their operational setup. Jenkins focused his attention on identifying heavy weapons positions and defensive structures, while Sarah analyzed the camp's logistics organization. Her training in supply chain management allowed her to assess the enemy's operational capabilities based on their supply storage patterns and distribution methods. "They have enough supplies for extended operations," Sarah whispered while sketching the camp layout in her notebook. "But their ammunition storage is centralized in that cluster of tents near the command area. Single point of failure for their entire operation." Jenkins followed her gaze toward the supply area, immediately understanding the tactical implications. If we could eliminate their ammunition stockpile, the entire siege would collapse within days. But it's heavily guarded and located in the center of their defensive perimeter. Sarah continued studying the enemy camp, noting patterns in their security rotations and supply handling procedures. The centralized ammunition storage was indeed heavily defended, but the enemy's confidence in their position had led to predictable routines that could potentially be exploited. More importantly, Sarah observed that the enemy's command structure appeared to be concentrated in a single large tent positioned near the ammunition storage area. Several individuals wearing different uniforms moved in and out of this tent, suggesting the presence of senior leadership directing the siege operations. "Jenkins, do you see the command tent?" Sarah pointed toward the center of the enemy camp. "If we could eliminate their leadership and ammunition simultaneously, their entire force would be neutralized without a direct assault." Jenkins studied the target area carefully before responding. "The approach will be suicide. Too much open ground, too many sentries. We'd never get close enough to plant effective charges." However, Sarah was developing a different concept based on her observations of the enemy's daily routines. The ammunition stockpile was resupplied every morning by a convoy that followed a predictable route through the mountains. Intercepting this convoy could achieve the same tactical effect while avoiding the risks of attacking the well-defended camp. "What if we don't attack the camp directly?" Sarah suggested. "Their supply convoy uses that road through the Eastern Pass every morning. If we could intercept it before it reaches the camp, we could eliminate their ammunition resupply and potentially capture intelligence about their operations." Jenkins considered this alternative approach with growing interest. The supply convoy would be vulnerable during its movement through the mountain passes, and intercepting it would achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. They could deny ammunition resupply to the enemy force, while potentially capturing valuable intelligence about their overall strategy. Sarah's analysis was interrupted by movement in the enemy camp below. A patrol was departing the main encampment, heading directly toward their observation position. Jenkins immediately began preparing for emergency extraction, but Sarah realized they might have an opportunity to gather even more critical intelligence. "Wait," Sarah whispered urgently. "If we can observe their patrol procedures, we might learn their security protocols for the entire area." Jenkins reluctantly agreed to remain in position, though he kept his weapon ready and maintained constant watch on potential escape routes. The enemy patrol consisted of 4 fighters moving in standard formation through the terrain below their position. Sarah watched the patrol's movement carefully, noting their communication procedures, navigation methods, and reaction to potential threats. The enemy fighters were clearly well-trained, but they followed predictable patterns that suggested extensive drilling rather than combat experience. More importantly, Sarah observed that the patrol was equipped with communication gear that appeared to be more sophisticated than what they had encountered during the convoy ambush. This suggested that the enemy force was receiving support from a larger organization with access to advanced military equipment. "They have better communications than we initially assessed," Sarah whispered while the patrol passed beneath their position. "Professional radios, encryption capabilities, probably GPS navigation. This isn't a local militia group." Jenkins nodded grimly as he reached the same conclusion. 4 military advisors, possibly special operations. That explains their tactical proficiency and equipment superiority. The revelation had significant implications for planning any counterattack from the outpost. They were facing a professional military force with advanced equipment and training, not the irregular fighters that Morrison had originally assumed. However, Sarah's observations had also revealed that even professional forces could be vulnerable when their patterns became predictable. As the enemy patrol disappeared into the darkness, Sarah and Jenkins began their careful withdrawal toward the outpost. They had gathered enough intelligence to fundamentally change the tactical situation, but they needed to return safely with their observations before developing any operational plans. The return journey required extreme caution, as the enemy force had demonstrated much greater sophistication than originally expected. Jenkins modified their route to avoid areas where additional patrols might be operating, while Sarah maintained continuous observation for any signs of detection. They reached the outpost perimeter just before dawn, having spent over 6 hours in enemy territory gathering intelligence. Rodriguez and Morrison were waiting anxiously for their report, understanding that the information they brought back would determine the outpost's survival strategy. Sarah's detailed briefing fundamentally changed everyone's understanding of their tactical situation. The enemy force was larger, better equipped, and more professional than anyone had realized. However, her analysis had also identified specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited through careful planning and precise execution. The ammunition convoy represents our best opportunity, Sarah concluded her briefing. It's their single point of failure, and intercepting it would cripple their entire operation without requiring a direct assault on their main position. Rodriguez studied Sarah's sketches and notes with obvious respect for her analytical capabilities. Her transformation from logistics specialist to tactical intelligence asset had been remarkable, and her insights were proving invaluable for mission planning. Morrison was initially skeptical about attacking the supply convoy, arguing that their limited manpower made any offensive operation extremely risky. However, Sarah's intelligence indicated that the convoy escort was minimal, making it a much more feasible target than the heavily defended main camp. How many vehicles in the convoy? Rodriguez asked while studying the route map Sarah had prepared. 3 trucks, 1 escort vehicle, Sarah replied confidently. Approximately 12 fighters total, moving in standard convoy formation. They follow the same route and timing every day, which makes them predictable and vulnerable to ambush. Collins, who had been listening to the briefing with growing excitement, volunteered to lead the convoy interdiction mission. His attitude toward Sarah had completely reversed since witnessing her tactical capabilities, and he now sought opportunities to implement her operational recommendations. However, Rodriguez recognized that Sarah's involvement in the mission would be critical for its success. Her ability to analyze enemy patterns and coordinate complex operations had proven itself during the convoy ambush, and intercepting the supply convoy would require similar tactical coordination. Sarah, we need you to plan and coordinate this operation, Rodriguez announced. Your analysis identified the opportunity, and your tactical coordination will be essential for successful execution. The assignment represented the ultimate evolution of Sarah's military role. From cargo girl responsible for logistics management, she had become the primary tactical planner for a critical combat operation. The outpost's survival and the lives of 18 soldiers now depended on her ability to translate intelligence analysis into successful military action. Sarah accepted the responsibility with a mixture of pride and terror. Planning combat operations was far beyond anything covered in her logistics training, but her recent experiences had demonstrated that she possessed instincts and capabilities that extended far beyond formal education. The interdiction mission would require careful coordination between multiple elements. Sarah's plan involved positioning assault teams at 2 points along the convoy route, while a third team blocked the enemy's retreat path. The timing would need to be perfect to prevent any vehicles from escaping and reporting the attack. Collins volunteered to lead the main assault element, while Jenkins would coordinate the blocking position. Sarah would maintain overwatch and coordinate timing for the entire operation, using the same analytical skills that had proven successful during the convoy ambush. Morrison expressed concern about committing so many soldiers to an offensive operation when the outpost itself remained under siege. However, Sarah's intelligence indicated that eliminating the enemy's ammunition resupply would force them to withdraw within days, potentially ending the siege without further combat. If we succeed, the siege ends, Sarah explained while reviewing the operational plan. If we fail, we're no worse off than we are now. The enemy's ammunition advantage disappears either way, since our attack will force them to expend their reserves defending against our assault. Rodriguez approved the mission over Morrison's objections, recognizing that passive defense would eventually lead to the outpost's fall through attrition. Sarah's plan offered their only realistic chance of breaking the siege and maintaining their strategic position in the region. The interdiction team departed the outpost before dawn, moving through terrain that Sarah had carefully studied during her reconnaissance mission. Her route planning avoided known enemy positions while providing multiple options for withdrawal if the mission encountered unexpected complications. Sarah established her coordination position on a ridgeline that provided oversight of the entire convoy route. From this location, she could observe the enemy supply convoy's approach and coordinate the timing for all assault elements simultaneously. The enemy convoy appeared exactly on schedule, following the same route and formation that Sarah had observed during her intelligence gathering. 3 supply trucks loaded with ammunition and equipment, escorted by a single vehicle carrying approximately 8 fighters armed with automatic weapons. Sarah keyed her radio as the convoy entered the designated kill zone. All elements, stand by for execute command. Target convoy is proceeding on schedule, maintaining standard formation. Collins acknowledged the transmission from his concealed position, while Jenkins confirmed readiness from the blocking position further down the mountain road. Everything was proceeding exactly as Sarah had planned, with the enemy convoy completely unaware of the ambush waiting ahead. Execute, 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 Sarah commanded as the lead vehicle reached the optimal position for simultaneous engagement by all assault elements. The ambush erupted with devastating effectiveness. Collins' team eliminated the escort vehicle with concentrated fire, while Jenkins' blocking position prevented any retreat by the supply trucks. Within minutes, the entire enemy convoy had been neutralized, and their critical ammunition stockpile was captured intact. Sarah coordinated the rapid withdrawal of all assault elements as enemy reinforcements began responding from their main encampment. However, the mission had already achieved complete success, eliminating the enemy's ammunition resupply and capturing valuable intelligence documents from the convoy escort. The impact of Sarah's operation was immediate and decisive. Without ammunition resupply, the enemy force began withdrawing from their siege positions within 24 hours. The outpost strategic position was maintained, and the isolated garrison had been saved through Sarah's tactical planning and coordination. Rodriguez's final report credited Sarah with single-handedly developing the intelligence and operational plan that broke the siege. Her transformation from cargo girl to tactical operations coordinator had been complete, earning recognition throughout the military chain of command. Collins approached Sarah as the convoy prepared to depart the no longer isolated outpost. "You saved all of us," he said simply. "Every soldier in this garrison owes their life to your tactical analysis and operational planning." Sarah accepted the recognition with quiet pride, understanding that her military career had been permanently changed by the events of the past week. She had proven that effective military service extended far beyond traditional combat roles, and that analytical thinking could be as valuable as physical courage in achieving mission success. The convoy departed the outpost carrying not only the satisfaction of mission accomplishment, but also the knowledge that conventional assumptions about military roles and capabilities had been fundamentally challenged. Sarah's nickname, Cargo Girl, would persist, but its meaning had evolved to reflect tactical competence rather than logistical limitation. As they drove through the mountain passes toward their home base, Sarah reflected on how completely her understanding of military service had changed. She had enlisted to serve her country through logistics support, never imagining that she would develop capabilities in tactical analysis, combat coordination, and operational planning. The success of their mission had saved lives and maintained a critical strategic position. However, more importantly, it had demonstrated that every soldier possessed capabilities that extended far beyond their formal training and assigned roles. Sarah's story would inspire other support personnel to develop their tactical thinking and contribute more broadly to mission success. The convoy's return to base marked the end of what had begun as a routine supply mission, but had evolved into a complex combat operation requiring every available skill and capability. Sarah's transformation from logistics specialist to tactical coordinator represented the best traditions of military adaptability and professional development. Her final report documented not only the successful completion of their supply mission, but also the tactical innovations and analytical methods that had made their success possible. The lessons learned would be incorporated into training programs, ensuring that future logistics personnel will be better prepared for the tactical challenges they might encounter in combat zones.